at the firm that I work for now. Like, I don't think they know how tall I am because I've never been to the office. Like, we have this hybrid learning thing, right? And the pandemic has taught us how to overcome these challenges. The world keeps moving on, and we have to figure out a way to adapt. And when it came down to this thesis, I also thought about that. And I thought about how can I reach this site without reaching the site? How do I talk to these people without physically being there? How do I use technology to my advantage?
And to be patient in an emergency is a terrible trial.
Unprecedented times call for new ways of thinking. How can our traditional ways of working respond to the climate crisis and social disruptions, especially in light of a global pandemic? What's next for architects building the future?
Welcome back to Building Hope, a podcast from the University of Maryland's Architecture School. I'm Vincenza Perla, a current graduate student.
And I'm Julie Gabrielli, a professor of architecture at the University of Maryland. In this season of Building Hope, we're featuring environmentally visionary architecture projects to explore how good design can build hope in a world facing a climate emergency.
In this episode, we talk with Christian Romero, who during the pandemic shutdown found creative ways to engage people thousands of miles away using social media. He heard their stories, learned their preferences, and offered design options. In short, he listened.
Professor Brian Kelly was his advisor on the project. Brian joins us for part of this conversation about how architects can best serve the communities in which we work.
My project's located in a small harbor village called Huizquil in El Salvador, in the main city of La Union. That's actually where my parents are from and where they migrated from during the Civil War. And I chose this site because I just had really bad memories about it. And I just remembered a disheveled home that my grandma used to live in, and me just hating it. And growing up, I realized that those memories kind of shaped my architecture ideology in the future. So I guess I just chose it just because I wanted to give back to the communities that kind of made what architecture is for me today, and helping them in some way, somehow, without being condescending, because I didn't want to just go up there and tell them what they should be doing without having any idea what it really is like. Being a first generation student, it really makes you question where you fit in that larger community of being Latino, of being El Salvadorian, without actually being there, without actually living there.
So Brian, as Christian's thesis committee chair, I'm curious what your reaction was when Christian told you that he was going to crowdsource his research using social media.
Well, I would underscore everything that Christian said about the fact that we were in an unprecedented situation and had to move forward with daily business, that the digital technologies, crowdsourcing connections to distant communities seemed like the only way to have stakeholder input, which I think was, from the very start important to Christian. And then either partway through the thesis, or maybe it was through the research for the thesis, there was a lecturer that came to the university from LA, and she presented a methodology for getting stakeholder input. And fairly quickly, I think the gears started turning in Christian's head about, well, I might not be able to do this in person. I can adapt what's on the shelf, soft technologies, to help inform my decision-making process in the thesis. What was interesting is, I think, the soft technologies, which we didn't think were all that radical, actually ended up becoming much more radical in the development of his thesis. meaning that he started off with an idea that he was going to digitally print houses all over his thesis site. And a lot of the input from the stakeholders kept swaying him in a different direction. And what's interesting is that sometimes these unprecedented opportunities still do rely on precedent. What we were finding is people wanted houses to look like houses and not necessarily something from the movie Dune or something like that. You know, they were looking for, you know, what they aspired to live in. And, you know, it's not unlike what many people lived in that already had houses already. So it was interesting that the soft technologies ended up, I think, having a huge impact on the project and where the project went at the end of the day.
So when we talk about innovation being necessary, maybe to solve pressing social and environmental problems, the people on the receiving end in the community might see innovation in a totally different way, or they might not be all that enthusiastic about something that's quote unquote innovative.
Well, and it's also, I think, kind of an issue of architecture as it's practiced in the United States. I mean, most architects do not do single family residential homes. Architecture as a profession only engages a very small percentage of single family homes. Most homes are builder built or built by developers without the involvement of architects in the process. Oftentimes, I think that architects are rather detached from what the general population might like. They see themselves as the prescribers of style. And the nice thing about the lesson I think that Christian got out of this is that he got a lesson of interacting with stakeholders, clients, that most students don't get when they're in architecture school. That kind of thing doesn't usually happen until you're out in practice. And so I think that prepared him well for transition back into the office.
Yeah, no, exactly what Brian was saying. Like, I had so many ideas, so many test prints, because I had a little mini 3D printer of what I wanted this new innovative home to look like. And I wanted to almost like force feed it to them, right? Like, here, you take it. Like, you're going to get this because I made it cool. I made this cool site plan. The community is going to engage this way because I said so. And then it was a hard pill to swallow when I gave it to them. I gave it to my grandma, out of all people. You know, this whole thesis was about my grandmother. And I gave it to her and she said, what is this? Like, this doesn't make any sense. And, you know, it just showed me, like, it made me question what architecture really is, what our role in designing communities really is about, right? Like, are we designing for the community or with the community? So it was a really interesting process.
Yeah, I'm actually very curious about what you learned about, or how your thinking evolved about the role of architects from that experience, or like, what does it mean to be an architect?
As a undergrad and even going through graduate school, the idea of architect to me were folks like Bjarke Ingels or Taro Ando, these architects that are artists, right? That push the envelope of what space means to people, and trying to make everything unique. For me, it was about fighting the system, even with Professor Kelly, right? Throughout my thesis, I butted heads. I was like, you know what, you told me to do this, but I'm not going to do it just because I'm an artist. I'm going to do something else. I want to push it even further. I'm not going to do what you tell me to do. And I ended up realizing that, but you know, even now studying to become a licensed architect, they tell you there that you have to be the agents for your clients, that you are their representative. Even if that means them not being able to afford something, doesn't mean that you should care any less. So for me, an architect now is becoming more about the client and less about the building itself.
And that question of who is the client, because for your thesis, you got to have the client be the actual individuals in the community that you spoke about so eloquently at your presentation. And now I think the kind of work you're doing is more developer driven, which is obviously the financial model of how most projects are delivered in this country.
You know, it's all business. Architecture is a business. And at the end of the day, if it doesn't pay, you don't get paid. You don't feed your family. But where is that line drawn of you just building buildings for money and versus building buildings for the people that are supposed to serve? You're doing this for money, and that's great. And you're developing these nice, projects to house a lot of people, probably for a lot of monthly rent dues and stuff like that, with a Starbucks or something in the bottom floor, retail with a bookshop. But you didn't ask people what they wanted. Like, why are you just putting that there without really asking them how they feel about it? And so I guess, I don't want to say I've been complacent in seeing this happening without putting my 2 cents in, like, yo, we should stop this and go ask the community for their engagement, whether it be a public school or just, mixed use building by a developer. Like, why can't we have both? Because I know for public schools, yeah, they have a couple of community meetings, a design charrette with them. But what about everything else? What about, like, why are you putting a gas station there when, there is no, there's no need for it? It's like, how do I step out of it as a young architect or aspiring architect? How do I step out of that complacency and put my foot down? And how do I fight back and say, we need the involvement of this community, especially this community that's underprivileged, underrepresented? How do I stand up? Should the profession have a department for environmental or community outreach?
Young architects like Christian are exploring different ways of serving their communities. We asked him how he thinks about working once he's a licensed architect.
Look around and see some of these young firms that are just really breaking the mold of how they work, and as a little firm in DC where they develop their own projects. They do small one-off projects, but they find the money, they find the investors, they act as the developer and the client, so they can do what they want. It's not at a scale that some of these other folks are working at, but I think you're asking the right questions. It's like, until we ask those questions, it'll just keep on going the way it's been going.
It's almost like sustainability, right? The movement of sustainability in architecture has grown and grown more compared to like the Frank Lloyd Wright era, where there's no insulation in their walls. Like, who cares? And now it's like, it's mandatory. There's codes for it. There's certifications for it. You get tax credits, rebates for it. And now will environmental justice be a part of that too in the future? I hope.
Like code required, policy required.
Yeah, like code requires you to, like, I don't know, something, right? Like,
yeah, build. Well, like, here's one. Talk about climate resilience is kind of a new term. Not new, but it's an evolving term instead of sustainability. Like we would say, I'm making a climate resilient building or a climate resilient community, and that's a role, a leadership role that architects are starting to claim. I don't know if you're seeing that in the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I am. So.
Christian began his thesis thinking it was a chance to showcase his design talent and to demonstrate skills he'd acquired through 6 years of architectural education. But when he heard the stories of his grandmother's neighbors and learned their preferences, he shifted instead to respond to their feedback and offer design options.
He's got this novel approach of crowdsourcing via social media that kind of broke the mold of how we do thesis at Maryland. We asked his thesis chair, Brian Kelly, to reflect on the context of Christian's evolution.
How did working with Christian during this pandemic, at a time of a lot of social upheaval as well, how did that inform your own thinking about the role of architects in solving these big pressing social and environmental problems? And that could spill over into your thinking about architectural education more broadly.
Yeah, I think it helped Christian immensely to, a lot of times what thesis students will do in a thesis project is they'll develop a series of avatars that represent stakeholders, and they invent them. So by doing that, it's questionable as to whether or not they really represent any kind of stakeholders or not. And then they sort of pin up pictures of those people, and then when they go to finalize their design, they talk about the design in terms of how these avatars use that design. I found this experiment with social media that Christian entered into that facilitated a representation of somebody other than Christian to be incredibly powerful and helpful. And it makes me think that there ought to be ways earlier on in students' education to get them to understand the value of having other stakeholders, other perspectives, so that they realize that, yes, architecture is an art, and in some respects, architects are like artists, but there's a bigger aspect to architecture, because fundamentally it makes the public realm, and it is always public. What it dislodged in Christian was the opportunity to question the idea of the architect as the genius artist creator, and tempered that. I don't believe in a totally bottom-up system, but I also don't believe in a totally top-down system. And I think what Christian navigated in his thesis was some kind of rapprochement between the bottom-up and the top-down, and that he located himself as an emerging professional between those two forces, as a kind of conductor or as an arbitrator, as those two forces came together. And I think that was actually quite a mature thing. And a lot of time I was skeptical as to whether he's going to get any input at all from people in social media, but huzzah, he did it.
And that's an interesting dynamic, because we do have that expertise, and you did bring this idea of 3D printing that you researched all these precedents that are working on building, radically affordable communities around the region. So, we do have an expertise, and we are allowed to use our expertise. It's not like we're forcing it on people. They rely on us in some ways. One of the things we're wrestling with in this podcast series is the idea of radical imagination, and bringing that to bear on these dynamically interrelated problems that we face as a society. And so one question that we came up with was, must a project be made of daring avant-garde forms to be radical? Or could it be that daring avant-garde thinking about, say, climate resilience or social justice may well result in just humble, simple forms?
I think imagination gets better with experience. I think early on, radical innovation, imagination, that kind of stuff is kind of silly to ask a student to do, because they don't have all the tools to do it with yet. I think as one matures, it's easier to form that radical thing into something tangible, something ultimately buildable and livable. I think oftentimes design studio projects are too long, and they're not broken into enough components, and they become so much about, like, did you do a good plan, or how's your elevation fit into the context, that kind of stuff. So I think it's important to foster conversations and opportunities to think outside of the box. But at other points in time, I think it's incumbent on us as architects to look at how you make the box and ensure, you may have some radical ideas, but they may be tempered by not only the buildability of something, but as I said before, the livability of something. And the assessment from the stakeholders, I think, was so important in this thesis, because it helped to temper and guide Christian's decision-making process. Otherwise, it would have been totally outside of the box thinking, and I don't think it would have pushed Christian either professionally or intellectually had he not done what he did by having community stakeholders involved in the genesis of his project.
The forms that you came up with are so simple and so classic and almost timeless. You know, these sort of overarching roofs that create these shady places where people can have indoor outdoor living, clear stories that allow for breezes to come through and cool off the inside rooms. Just really simple but elegant, forms that also work well when you aggregate them together to create a block or a community.
In his thesis presentation, Christian spoke about the colonial legacy of town planning in Westkiel. So we asked whether he positioned his project as a critique or a challenge of that top-down gridded geometry.
When I did my research, it's funny how even the colonial planning, it directed people and spaces towards the harbor and kind of, I guess, uniting the people through main roads, accesses to the harbor. And those early planning stages, during the earlier times, at first I felt like we should step away from that. So I came up with plans that were almost like circular in nature, stepping away from an axial street grid that leads to the harbor that was set there by early colonists that wanted you to have access to either the church or to the harbor and kind of benefit them. It became, okay, how can it be different? And then I realized that, okay, the people that live here now rely on those grids, rely on those early settlements to get around to places, to set up shop. And all these homes have the similar style with a large front porch that's gated. In order for them to sell, it's almost like a mercado style, where you walk down the street to the harbor or to the church and you see everything you need in terms of, you need a cup of coffee, you need some snacks. My grandma sells snacks still to this day, just because of the nature of the way that the site was planned in the very early stages. And so I realized that when designing the site at first, I wanted something circular, I wanted something cool and unique, but it didn't work. So my site kind of reflected earlier planning stages of colonial times, because it fit the people, the people's needs better. It fit what they actually use the site for. And so you start to see that in my site. You start to see these access grids that lead to spaces that are necessary, like community gathering spaces, gardens, spaces for play, spaces for, just relaxation, upbringing, like schools. And so that grid sort of evolved with, feedback from the people and realizing what was needed versus what I wanted to put there.
So it has that colonial past, that history, but it's also incredibly useful and familiar to people. So.
Exactly. Yeah, so it basically targets a harbor town that faces poverty, unhealthy living conditions, and the goal is to build a safer, cheaper, and more sustainable home alternative for the impoverished communities that's built for the community, by the community, and kind of guiding the community using tools such as social media to get their input in as many ways as I could, and kind of cater to them and not so much myself. The homes are to, stay harmonious with its users, and the users are to grow with the home. So it's not just something that you build and you just leave alone. They're designed to be evolved, kind of like elemental architecture. And then finally, the thesis itself kind of, how can I explain it? It becomes less about the homes itself and more about the process of learning to work with others, of learning to work for others, and learning how to work with a community as a tool that benefits you, not so much hinders you, because I know in the real estate development side, there's not so much wanting community outreach.
We were curious. I noticed in your presentation, you said that the houses, sort of the basic design, could be 3D printed in about 2 days for around $4,000 of materials. How did you come up with that figure?
Yeah, so that figure was actually based off of a company that's currently doing these types of homes in Mexico. It's called Icon, and they even have printers for sale for about like $4,000, $5,000. You give the community one printer, and you can build so many homes, so many, basic shelter needs for a community that's disheveled or dealing with crises like earthquakes. El Salvador actually had an earthquake in 2002 that put about like 500,000 people out of homes. So with something like this, with this technology, I don't see why we can't provide homes for these people, right? Like I don't see why there shouldn't be a way to take care of them. And so by using minimal amounts of material, concrete as the main structure, facade, there is no cladding on it. It's just literally layers and layers of concrete that can be changed with some color dyes, add some aggregates like coffee grinds that El Salvador is a big producer of coffee. So using that byproduct and being a little bit more sustainable and thinking about how we can use that in aggregates can not only be sustainable, but inexpensive.
So one other question about the community that your project is located in. What's going on with that now? And did you go back and show people there what you came up with? And are any of these? Is there any chance that some of these could be built?
Yeah, so I have reached back out. I actually reached out to like local councilmen and local leaders. And it's funny because a lot of the spaces are currently being developed now with homes that seem like they would have been printed, like they could have been printed. My mother's actually over there in El Salvador right now. And she took photos of all the spaces that I had envisioned for my site with development on them now. And I'm like, yo, that's crazy. Like it's cool to see that it's being developed, but knowing what could have been there, it's kind of sad. So I'm currently still waiting for more word from the higher ups on whether or not we can proceed with anything like this. It becomes more political than actually, economical, because this isn't something that a developer does. This is something that the community chooses to do. So it becomes kind of like a political game at this point.
Yeah. That's interesting.
So
I don't know about you, but when I did my thesis in grad school, you work on it so deeply that it felt real to me. I was so invested in it that it took a while for me to kind of come down from that and realize it's not actually a real building in the world. But I just look at your project and think, but it could be real. It could be.
yeah, I reached out to Icon. I've reached out to, the beginning of this project was just reaching out and make this thing physically appear, because I didn't want it to just be an idea.
Yeah.
And so it becomes much more challenging when you are a student, just because they don't really take you serious, and they don't really pay attention to you much. And so right now, I've actually been working with my cousin to translate my thesis as a whole. I have 96 pages, so I've been working with her to translate it, so that she can hand it over to local governments there to read, like here, like this isn't just an idea. This is something that I've researched and put some time into. I have plans. I've been developing them a little bit further to make it more concrete, because we don't really have much time to go into like the details. But making this thing a reality it's been my goal from the beginning of the thesis, and hopefully one day I'll get there.
Oh, I'm so glad you're translating it. That's exciting. Yeah. Cool.
It's a lot of words.
Yeah, it is a lot of work.
It was a lot of work doing it in English, and now doing it in Spanish, it's even worse.
We asked Christian to kind of take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Is this project radical? Does he see himself as part of a larger movement?
That's funny. I was thinking about this too earlier today. I was telling my fiance that I think this project is interesting not because of what I made, but what I learned individually. So for me, it's radical in terms of my personal growth. But that architecture has been done before, right? 3D printing has been done before. The spaces have been done before. It's not about that. It's about how you learn from it. And I think that part is radical.
Do you see yourself as part of a movement? And if so, how would you define it and how do you think it's going?
I think with the work I'm doing currently for the firm is not a movement. I'm gonna get in trouble, but once I get my license and I'm free to just kind of work on my own and confidently say, I can, stamp these drawings for you. It is a movement, right? To get not customer. I don't want to say customer because that involves like paying and stuff like that. But it is a movement where the users get to decide. It's not me giving you something anymore. But you get what I'm saying, where it's like it's a crowdsourced movement that focuses on the people, for the people, by the people. God bless America.
Or any other country.
Yeah, or any other country, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, there's also cooperative ownership models that people are exploring, like land trusts and community land trusts, where you can own the community cooperatively rather than having investors come in, because that's really the biggest hurdle, obviously, is how do you pay for it? Well, it sounds like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but from what you were saying earlier too, it sounds like the community itself works really well. It's just that people are not well housed. The actual homes are in poor repair, or they don't have their own homes that they need. But sort of the day-to-day interactions, the things they do, the schools, the sports, all of that in your presentation, I can totally see it.
Yeah.
It looks real. It is real.
Yeah. I mean, it works. It's there. Like, we just have to, okay, you're doing the right thing. Like, let me just help you out by giving you the space you need, the shelter, the extra field that you need, the space you need. It's a working microcosm. It's a little economy. It's a little world of its own, working together. And that's what stopped me from doing my thing, right? My architectural dream of designing honeycombs and whatever. And it made me realize it's not me, it's you. You guys are doing it. I'm realizing that now. Like, you're teaching me.
It's like the reverse of if you build it, they will come. It's like they're already there. And then you build it.
Exactly. And that's, going back to that colonial thought, it was like, yeah, they built it. They went there and kind of took over and started at it, but we reclaimed it and we made it ours. We made it work for us.
I thought one of the most striking things about your presentation was the storytelling, and Brian referenced that earlier too. Why do you think that sort of storytelling resonated so strongly with people?
I feel like in architecture school, we learn how to storytell on a very minimal level, right? We have an idea and okay, it looks like this and I want to build it this way because I for example, music. I once had a project in undergrad where it was a site of an old jazz club and I wanted it to reference back to history. I wanted it to resonate with the jazz community. But then using storytelling in my thesis, it became more of I want to do this because of the history. I want to do this because it means something to someone, right? And it's something real. It's not just, it's respecting the history. No, it's not. This is more than just respecting the history. This is doing something for someone that's currently going through this at this present moment. And this is starting just because of a memory that I had. Just because it's a memory for me doesn't mean that it's not still happening. And so when I tell those stories in architecture school, it's almost like, why are you being kind of like a Debbie Downer, or why are you being so deep into how do you remember the rain falling down on the roof? Why do you remember like the heat? Why do you remember all of that? That is because those are things that you're not taught in school. Like those are things that you don't really like notice unless you do like study abroad or something. And when people come back from study abroad, it's almost like life changing because they realize, whoa, like these things that I'm feeling abroad are not what I think and feel back home. So when I was telling these stories, they're not stories, they're things that are happening.
It's real. They're real people.
Real
And
people.
it's more about it's more about their future than it is about their past in a way.
Exactly. So how can we find something, a problem? How do we not fix it, but how do we work with them to do something about it? Not just make believe, kind of like what Professor Kelly was saying about avatars. We design for avatars, less of real people. And that's why I feel like it resonated more.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too, like when I did the polls and then did the research, I was being kind of creepy and actually seeing the people that responded, right? Because I did surveys on what these people do, what do they do? Some were bakers, some were construction workers, some were students, but they were all in it together in the same community. So I actually went through their profiles and was like, oh, like, look at their little family type of thing. Oh, look, they have a dog. And I'm like, this becomes even more than just like, I have some renderings with like, I would have to find like these dog models, these families, and put them in my renderings just because I saw it in one of the people that took the polls. I saw it on their Instagram post and I'm like, that's so cute. I want to put it in my rendering. It's weird, I know.
But it is a little voyeuristic, but it's also like it's a way of grounding in the real place and the real people's lives. And like the renderings that you have of the people queuing up to get bread from the baker's house. It made me think of this bakery in Tucson. There's always a line and it's always a block long. It's this tiny little hole in the wall commercial place, but they have the best bread you've ever had. And it's like, I saw the drawing that you did of the baker's house. And I was like, oh my God, I know what that bread tastes like.
Yeah, it's funny. No, that's okay, so like this thesis started with all my memories about this place. And that was another memory, like people lining up at a house that looks like a house. I'm like, what are you doing? Like, why are you guys outside on the street like that? But they're waiting for some delicious bread and snacks. And it all makes sense when you're there. But being outside, you're like, what? Wait until you try my grandma's tostones, then you'll be good.
That's
Then
right.
you'll understand.
Wow. All right. Last question is, how are you building hope?
I guess I would say I'm building hope by listening. That's it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Building Hope. Our final episode is Building Hope from Vision to Action, which touches on post-thesis recovery, activism at work, and how current students and faculty are building hope.
Building Hope is
Julie Gabrielli, Director.
Vincenzo Perla, Research Assistant.
Maisha Islam, Graphic Designer.
Rona Cobell, Editor.
Raymar Toison, Music.
Hannah Zozobrado, Assistant Producer and Social Media Head.
Gabriella Feinberg, Technical Director and Producer.
You can watch a slideshow of this and all the other great projects on our YouTube channel at Building Hope Pod.
Visit our website, buildinghopepodcast.com, for show notes, transcripts, guest bios, and curriculum materials.
We're also on Instagram at Building Hope Pod.
And on Substack at Building Hope.
Please share and rate Building Hope on your favorite podcast app to help others find us too. This project is supported by a Faculty Student Research Award from the Graduate School, University of Maryland, as well as grants from the university's Sustainability Fund and the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation.